Before analyzing social character orientations, we need to clarify Fromm's conception of a successful, or as he coins it, of a productive life and coexistence. Fromm's focus here is on the question of the mental psychological health and well-being of the individual and society. The starting point for what Fromm calls a productive character orientation is, on the one hand, the special biological situation of man, to be determined less and less by instinctive genetic specifications, but to be able to create new forms of relatedness with a means of self-consciousness and imagination. On the other hand, man shares with all forms of life an intrinsic tendency to want to unfold the growth potentials possible for this form of life, here symbolized in a daisy which wants to come to bloom even in the smallest crack. Fromm calls this growth tendency biophilia, love for life or love for the living. The growth potentials possible for man results above all from his neuronal abilities, the self-reflexive cognitive abilities, what we call his ability for reasonable thinking, the imagination-directed affect control, which finally can lead to loving feelings, and imaginative reality generation, what we usually call creative fantasy. There is convincing evidence for the biophilic growth tendencies in man, described by Fromm and Man for himself as productive reason, love and work. For example, the infant strives to want to develop its physical potential, but above all, the intrinsic dynamics of psychosocial development. As indicators for a biophilic or productive psychosocial development, the following should be mentioned. The first indicator is the ability to distinguish between I and the body, what we call body self. The difference be able to distinguish between the I and the non-I, what leads to the ability for a sense of identity and for what we call the ability to see an object as an object. The ability to distinguish between positive and negative aspects of reality, of other people, and one's own self, what we call the ambiguity ability. Or the ability to tolerate ambiguous perceptions and feelings, that is, to feel both and not only either or, in others and in oneself, and not to project and split it. This ability we call the ability for ambivalence. The ability to distinguish between I and an affect or a feeling. That is to say, the ability to control our affects. The ability to distinguish between I and what is my desire, I and what is a fantasy, I and what is only virtual or a fiction. That's what we call reality control or sense of reality or objectivity. And the ability to distinguish between socially given and own value concepts, which finally leads to an individualized social self-esteem. All mentioned abilities or competencies are indicators for a biophilic growth tendency, which, however, can only develop in humans under the stimulating and containing influence of auxiliary selves, of caregivers. To the extent that they can develop and are actually practiced, they become productive own powers of the human being, which give the human being an optimum of independence, of autonomy and freedom. If the development is hindered, the abilities develop only to a limited extent and will be lost again under stressful situations. And if the development is thwarted, instead of a biophilic growth tendency, a destructive, or as Fromm says, necrophilic decay tendency occurs. Thus, Fromm's theory of an innate biophilic growth tendency provides an open model of human nature. His core thesis is that a productive life and living together presupposes the practice of the optimally differentiated cognitive, emotional, and imaginative own powers of the human being. According to Fromm, any kind of transformation, economic, social, personal, organizational, therefore requires that the cognitive, emotional, and imaginative powers be strengthened in many people, because only these possess the transformative strength to not make people dependent again. For social character orientations will be presented in this section: the authoritarian, the marketing, and the narcissistic character orientation, and finally the ego-oriented social character. In each case, outlining the basic and partial strivings. We will then consider which non-productive strivings and values are demanded and promoted in the social character concerned, and which productive forces of growth are not to be supported but instead repressed where possible. Any kind of transformation, whether in counseling, therapy, or organizational restructuring, should always aim, on the one hand, to identify the counterproductive strivings in the individual social character and to reduce their strengths. And on the other hand, to create structural conditions which enable the repressed productive forces of growth. That is to say, their own powers to think, to feel, and to act, to be experienced and practiced again.